Northern Ireland, and again it will be fairly blustery here, and those showers become a little bit more widespread on Friday, but the weather tends to settle down somewhat into the weekend. Plenty of fine weather to come, a bit cooler with temperatures returning to around average.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome to On the Money, where we're focused on the UK's cost of living crisis, helping you beat the squeeze. I'm Liam Halligan. For the next hour, we'll be talking about those worrying new inflation numbers. The consumer price index was 9% higher in April than the same month in 2021, as the cost of living spirals. With inflation at a 40-year high then, will this ongoing squeeze push ministers into announcing emergency support for hard-pressed households? And separately, what's the future for our railways? With passenger numbers still well down on pre-pandemic levels, will working from home be the final nail in the coffin? All that and more after the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
A very good morning to you. Good afternoon. I'm sorry, it's 1 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright here to keep you up to date on GB News. Well, at Prime Minister's questions today, Labour repeated its call for a windfall tax on energy companies to help with the rising cost of living on the day inflation rate hit a 40-year high. The consumer price index hit 9% in the 12 months to April. That's up from 7% in March. Well, speaking at PMQs, the Prime Minister promised to look at all measures available to help struggling families. But Sir Keir Starmer accused the government of inaction.
Whilst he dithers, British households are slapped with an extra £53 million on their energy bills every single day. Meanwhile, every single day, North Sea oil and gas giants rake in £32 million in unexpected profit.
We're already spending £22 billion. We're already helping people with the cost of living in any way that we can, Mr. Speaker. But the reason we can do that is because we took the tough decisions to get this country through COVID, to make sure that we came out of lockdown in the way that was necessary, and to have a strong economy.
A Conservative MP has been released on bail pending further investigation after being arrested on suspicion of rape and sexual assault offences between 2002 and 2009. The man, who can't be named for legal reasons, is in his 50s. He's also accused of abusing a position of trust and misconduct in public office. The Tory chief whip has asked the MP to stay away from Parliament during the investigation. The Foreign Secretary says it would be very positive if the UK and the EU could negotiate a solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol, but said there must not be a delay. Liz Truss has set out plans to rewrite Britain's post-Brexit trading agreement, changing the rules on how goods enter Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. The Democratic Unionist Party is currently refusing to join the executive instalment until a solution is found. The Northern Ireland Minister, Conor Burns, told GB News the government couldn't idly stand by.
This is more important to get this right for our United Kingdom and for communities in Northern Ireland than almost any other foreign policy or economic objective, and that is our determination. We hope that the EU will re-engage with us in a spirit of compromise and create the necessary space to allow us to find a way through that. But we will legislate in the interests of our own country if that's what it comes to.
Is that a threat?
No, it's just a reality.
Boris Johnson has welcomed Finland and Sweden officially applying to join NATO and says it is a historic day for the alliance. The applications from both Nordic countries were spurred on by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Swedish and Finnish NATO ambassadors visited the organisation's headquarters in Brussels to present Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg with their letters of application. All 30 members of the alliance need to approve the process, which could take up to a year. A 13-year-old boy has been arrested on suspicion of sharing Islamist terrorist material online. The teenager was detained in West London yesterday, but he's since been released on bail until mid-June. Investigators say it's still very rare for teenagers to be arrested for terrorism, but there's been a recent uptick in recent years. More than 260 small boats have crossed the English Channel into UK waters so far this year, GB News can confirm. 7 small boats were spotted on the English side of the Channel yesterday, and 285 people were transferred then onto Border Force and rescue vessels. That takes the total number of people who've been pulled from small boats to over 8,700 this year. That's more than double the number who crossed this time last year. In Seville, streets are closed, barriers are set up, officers are on alert as more than 100,000 Scottish football fans arrive in the Spanish city. Rangers supporters have already been seen partying outside the stadium as they look forward to the Europa League final. The last and only time the Scottish club has ever won a European trophy was half a century ago. They kick off against Eintracht Frankfurt at 7 p.m. tonight. You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head to Liam for today's On the Money.
Coming up on The Money today, inflation is at a 40-year high and set to rise further. As millions of families struggle to make ends meet despite working all hours, will the government be forced to unveil an emergency budget and other one-off support measures? We hold a detailed discussion. The railway was one of the hardest hit sectors during the pandemic, but why, as life gradually returns to normal, are the UK's train companies still struggling to get back on track? We'll be talking about the state of passenger numbers and the future of our railway as more people work from home. Plus, it's my regular feature, Startup Britain Today, celebrating the UK's new and unique businesses. Today, we're talking to Harry George. He's managing director of a company which sells data to customers to help them drive sales, a key part of many marketing strategies these days. Is data the new oil, the driving force of any modern economy? Find out more later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. What do you think of the issues raised in today's On the Money? How do they impact you? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. I'll read out some of your messages later in the show, so stay with us. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and you're On the Money. So the new inflation data's out, and it's not pretty. During April, the Consumer Price Index was 9% higher than the same month last year. The Retail Price Index, which used to be the official measure, also including housing costs, was 11.1% up since April 2021. And for many lower-income households who spend a high share of their incomes on food and fuel, the prices of which have rocketed, of course, the genuine rise in the cost of living over the last year is a lot higher than even these headline numbers. For many millions across Britain, this cost of living crisis is now biting. There are increasingly angry calls for the government to do more to help cash-strapped households. Rishi Sunak's spring statement back in March is now widely viewed to have been deeply inadequate. The Chancellor raised taxation while increasing benefits by just 3.1%, far less than inflation, cutting the living standards of some of the UK's most vulnerable households at a crucial time. Even before war in Ukraine, inflation was already 5.5% in Britain, way above the Bank of England's 2% target. But this ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and the related economic war between West and East has sent fuel and food prices soaring. Russia and Ukraine between them ordinarily account for around a quarter of the world's total wheat exports. Supplies of wheat, barley and a host of other food produced by these nations are now partially blocked through shipping embargoes or war. That's why the Governor of the Bank of England yesterday warned of what he called apocalyptic food price rises. Having underestimated the speed with which inflation would rise, the government's now under increasing pressure to act. Labour's calling for an emergency budget, of course, and ministers don't want to be seen bowing to pressure. But as price pressures build, what's politically uncomfortable may have to give way to what's politically necessary. New support measures, even a windfall tax on the large energy companies. This spiralling cost of living crisis means everything is back on the table, and that's our On the Money question today. Will the government announce emergency support measures to counter the cost of living squeeze? Grown-up conversations with people who really know their stuff. That's what we do here on The Money. And today, I'm joined by Jane Armand. She's Director of Policy and Corporate Affairs at the Food and Drink Federation. Spiralling food prices, of course, key to this cost of living squeeze. Jane, great to have you with us. Frank van Leuven, he's the programme lead for macroeconomics at the New Economics Foundation. Great to have with you, Frank. Jerry Lyons, friend of the show, chief economist at Net Wealth, former chief economic advisor to Boris Johnson, one of Britain's most influential economists. Jerry, great to have you. And Vicky Price, chief economic advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, another On the Money regular. Great to have you with us all. Let's talk to you first, Jerry Lyons. Some people think that you should have been the last governor of the Bank of England. You must be looking on at what Andrew Bailey is doing, not necessarily with gritted teeth, but you must have concerns about the way the Bank of England has conducted itself in recent months.
Well, Liam, it's great to be on the show. Well, it's not just about the people, it's about the process and the policy. The process leaves a lot to be desired. We have groupthink dominating macroeconomic policy making in the UK, both at the Treasury and the Bank of England. But the policy has been completely wrong. Even though this is a supply-side shock in some respects, not all of the factors contributing to higher inflation are external to the UK. The Bank of England governor did not reassure the markets or indeed the general public with his comments on Monday when he said he was helpless. But the reality is that the economy needs a tighter monetary and a looser fiscal policy. Now, the challenge with the tighter monetary policy, though, is that two wrongs do not necessarily make a right. It was wrong last year to keep the foot on the monetary accelerator when the economy was clearly recovering and when inflationary pressures were inevitably clearly building. But also, it might be wrong to put the foot too aggressively on the monetary brake at the moment. Clearly, the direction has to be for tighter monetary policy. The speed, the scale and the sequencing of that has to be influenced by economic conditions. But just to conclude, we're in a cost of living crisis. Inflation is yet to peak, is going to stay elevated. But at the same time, we're now heading for a significant economic slowdown. A technical recession is inevitable in the UK. A full-blown recession is a possibility if the policy response is not appropriate and if policymakers fail to retain the confidence of the general public and the businesses. And with the comments we saw on Monday, policymakers are not maintaining confidence.
So a technical recession, that's 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction, Jerry is predicting there. Jane Armand, let's go to you. Of course, food prices are at the heart of this cost of living squeeze. Ukraine, Russia being major producers of food. You've got other major wheat exporters like India now ceasing to export because they're worried about their own food security. You represent an awful lot of people in the food and drink industry. It's a vast industry here in the UK. What's your sense of where food prices are going, and what are the impacts on your producers as their input costs go up? Are they going to eventually have to pass on those price pressures to consumers so we feel them in the shops?
Thanks, Liam, and it's good to be here with you today, although, as you say, it makes for sobering reading, today's figures of 6.7%. And we're seeing this really hitting UK food and drink manufacturers who, for now, a considerable period of time, have faced increased pressures and increased prices on all sorts of things, from ingredients, raw materials, the cost of packaging, the cost of transporting those goods. There are global factors. Obviously, the disruption that we saw across supply chains worldwide through COVID was a particular impact, but we're also seeing increased pressures, as you say, from the Ukraine crisis and increased global prices on commodities such as grains and oils, feeding further pressures into UK prices.
It's a really tough picture, isn't it, Vicky? And you and I, we drill down into the inflation numbers each month. OK, the headline number is 9. The number that used to be the headline number is 11.1. The number that really interests me is the PPI. You'll know exactly what that is, the Producer Price Index. The cost of those inputs that Jane Armand was just talking about across the food and drink sector and many other sectors. Input inflation, the Producer Price Index, 18.6%. That means there's more inflation going forward for consumers, right?
This is absolutely true, because if you're looking at inflation and looking at some of the countries where we're already seeing a bit of plateauing of inflation, such as in the US, for example, and possibly in some European countries too, although there is serious concern about what will happen if Russian gas is cut, whether the Europeans decided or the Russians decided. So that's going to be a big issue. So we wait to see what happens. But we're seeing that plateauing happening. Whereas what we're expecting here, I mean, given that producer prices are going up very significantly due to those input costs. The question is, how much of that will we see coming through to the final consumer?
Yeah.
Will the eventual sort of point where the price is charged going to be able to pass those costs on, or will they find themselves out of business? And that's the real issue, and that's the concern that we have generally about how the economy is going to move and what it also means for the UK's competitiveness in the long run.
Frank van Leuven, you're from the New Economics Foundation, which generally approaches economic policy from the left. You're more than welcome here on this show. When we're in a situation where the producer price index is twice what the retail price index is, then you know there's more inflation down the track. What's your sense of what the government needs to do now? Can they afford not to do an emergency budget?
I'd say absolutely not. There's two things when we separate the government, and you referred to it before, which is the Bank of England. My view actually is that the Bank of England should stay on course. We are in a situation right now where we had the biggest fall in retail sales in half a century. Consumer confidence is at a huge...
So you're worried raising interest rates more would make the situation worse, not better?
We've already raised rates, by 1% since December. So why not wait until more data comes in and then make a statement? And just, in terms of what's happened before, it's impossible for the Bank of England to forecast that there would be a war in the Ukraine. So that's one side of the government. I'd say hold fast there, wait and see, which is completely opposite to what the Treasury and the government is doing, which is take a wait and see approach. So I think there needs to be a role reversal right there. And there's a host of policies that the government should be doing effectively to target those who are going to be hit hardest, that you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, to protect the most vulnerable and make sure that they have at least a minimum standard of income that can help them get by.
I'm going to pick up that argument with Jerry Lyons after the break, but before we go to the break, I do want to go back to Jane Armand from the Food and Drink Federation. Jane, what's your message to the government? You are sitting at the top of a very influential lobby group. I'm sure that you and your members talk to ministers all the time. What do you now want to see? There's lots of talk of emergency help for households. What about for businesses?
We are having regular discussions with the government, and we would urge the government to continue looking at where they can make life easier for business, to cut the cost of production, to look at the regulation, both that's coming in and that is already there, where it can make a difference to how businesses are operating, and to continue to talk to us to ensure businesses continue to invest through these difficult times, because we will need it in the future.
And are you hopeful there will be stuff forthcoming? I mean, you guys, you're one of Britain's biggest manufacturing sectors. You're one of Britain's biggest employers. Are you getting any sense from ministers that they may actually make a move?
We are the largest manufacturing sector, food and drink, over 460,000 employees up and down the country. We're having regular conversations. We will continue to do so. And government will be listening to the UK's food and drink manufacturers.
Well, James, great to have you here on The Money. I look forward to welcoming you back on the show in the future. We are going to carry on this discussion with our other panellists after the break. This is On The Money with me, Liam Halligan. What do you think? Do you think interest rates should rise, or do you think that would make things worse? After the break, we'll also be visiting a butcher's in Mansfield to find out how they're coping with the current cost of living squeeze. Stay with us. You're On The Money.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome back. You're On The Money. It's 1:20. We're talking about this cost of living squeeze. CPI inflation, the consumer price index, it's 9% higher than this time last year. The retail price index is 11.1% higher. Lots of inflation coming down the pipeline as well. I'm still with my expert panel. Let's go back to Jerry Lyons. Jerry, you were formerly the chief economic advisor to someone called Boris Johnson. Frank van Leuven here of the New Economics Foundation, he's articulating a view that many people are articulating. I know you're concerned about the speed of interest rate rises now because you don't want to cause a recession that's worse than it otherwise would be. But Frank's saying interest rates should be kept on hold.
OK, why I actually said last week, if I was at the Bank of England's meeting last week, I would have voted to keep rates unchanged. I think the UK rates are far too low, and UK rates need to be significantly higher. Eventually, I think post this crisis, they need to be settling around 4% or so. But we're at 1% at the moment. The economy is very vulnerable to higher rates. But I think the point is we shouldn't have been starting from this place in the first place, but we are where we are. We have a tight tighter monetary policy. But if we have a tight monetary and tight fiscal policy, then I think we risk a sterling crisis. The markets will view the only room for manoeuvre, the only shock absorber being a weaker pound. That's why we do need to have an easing of fiscal policy. But I think in terms of monetary policy, interest rates will have to go higher. The challenge is this, as we know from the past, basically when you have inflation at 9%, interest rates of 1% are completely inadequate. The challenge is from where we are now to where we need to be. But I agree with your colleague, how one needs to move needs to be influenced by the economic environment. Ideally, we should have a tighter monetary and a looser fiscal stance. The tighter monetary policy to try and cap inflation, the looser fiscal stance to actually target help at those who most need it, and also tax cuts to help the squeeze middle. One needs to look at the two together. But if we suddenly put the foot on the monetary brake and keep it hard on the fiscal brake as well, then we will have a sterling crisis and problems will come to the fore. So, yeah, at the end of the day, monetary policy has to go tighter, no doubt about that. The speed, the scale has to be influenced not only by economic conditions, but also by the fiscal stance as well. The Bank of England was wrong last year, hence we're in this difficult situation at the moment. But it's a lot of nuance. Bottom line for the viewers and listeners is that the economy is going to be hit hard, and policy, whichever way you look at it on the monetary side, will eventually have to be tightened.
So Jerry's cautious approach there. He would have voted to keep rates where they were, but he's saying eventually monetary policy will have to tighten, interest rates will have to go up, if only to protect the pound. The pound is also a very important part of this policy conundrum, isn't it, Vicky? If the pound gets weaker, and it has been losing ground, particularly against the dollar, imports become more expensive. That drives up inflation, which pushes the pound down even more. You get into kind of a doom loop. Crikey, it's difficult for the Bank of England, isn't it?
Yes, but the Bank of England doesn't have any job to keep the pound strong. Certainly not the MPC. Well, yes, there could be a decision.
The Monetary Policy Committee,
yeah, the Monetary Policy
economists.
Committee really just looks at the target rate of inflation. And of course, it's influenced by input costs.
Yeah.
So the pound has an influence on this, but that's not their main job. So they're not going to be raising rates in order to keep the pound high. And we've seen the pound come down anyway. And I think the pound has been re-evaluated in terms of what it can do in the long term because of the growth scenario, which is much weaker. I mean, remember, just the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that produced its forecast just a month ago, downgraded the UK's forecast for next year much more than
lowest in the G7.
Absolutely. And so the pound is adjusting to that, really. Well, of course, you could have small ups and downs depending on the comparative interest rates. But frankly, I think the pound issue is not one that should concern us right now. And certainly the MPC is not going to do anything to keep the pound strong. But it is a question mark, though, how high rates would be. And I don't agree with Jerry that we should have interest rates at 4%. If you look at the inflation forecast, both of, yes, of course, they've been wrong in the past, but we've had a war in Ukraine, which we didn't forecast. But if you look at what the Federal Reserve thinks in the States, which is the central bank in the US, what the European Central Bank thinks in Europe, they all see inflation stabilizing, as I was suggesting earlier, and then really coming down to target levels with some tightening, obviously, of monetary policy. You're going to have that. We shouldn't overdo it by having too much fiscal and contraction. I think Jerry is right about that. But the general expectation is that we're going to see this reduction coming back to target. And what the European Central Bank was worried about for ages was that we would be getting down to deflation again, which is exactly where we were before we came out of COVID. And we were at a number of times during the financial crisis.
So in your view, you think interest rates should be peaking at like 1.5%, 2%?
Possibly 2%.
Rather than 3%, 4%, 5% where they were before the global financial crisis. That's interesting. Frank, let's get back to the details of how this crisis is impacting hard-pressed households. We know the Chancellor only raised benefits by 3.1%. And now we've got inflation of 9%. That's a real terms cut in living standards for some of our most vulnerable families, some of our most vulnerable households. You clearly want more targeted assistance. How would you target it? What would that emergency budget look like if you were writing it?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important to start with basically two problems. The first one is that since 2019, we've seen the incomes of the top 5% grow by about 3,000, while the incomes of the bottom 50% has grown has grown negatively.
Yeah,
We've seen
contracted.
about 100. So there's a difference in the growth of wages that has happened, and we need to address that. And that's systemic. The second part is the cost of living crisis, which we have now, which you mentioned earlier. And basically, those on the poorest families, this is going to affect them 7.5 times harder than the wealthy.
Because they spend such a high share of their income on food and fuel.
Exactly.
And they're going up by a lot more than these headline 9, 10, 11% numbers. They're 30, 40, 50% up on the year.
Precisely. So there's at least three things I could mention to do. The first one is exactly as you mentioned, which would be to raise benefits in line with inflation. So they plan to do that next year. Why not bring that forward and do that immediately? That's one thing that would help straight away. The second one is reversing the change to the £20 uplift.
Yeah, to universal credit. You want that restored. That was an emergency measure brought in for COVID, then it was removed. You want that restored.
Precisely. Okay. That would almost wipe out entirely that proportion to the lowest income households that will be wiped out by the energy crisis right now. It would see them through that.
Yeah.
The third one is this idea that we see, and actually it was just brought up today, about the home loan for warmer homes, right? That raising that from £200 to £600. I think that's generally it's a good idea to extend it, but we need to change that from it being a loan to effectively
a grant.
A grant.
Yeah,
exactly. And those three
and targeted via benefit recipients or lower council tax bands or a combination of the two.
I would say
you don't want to give it to everyone.
No, exactly.
Because a lot of people will just spend it on wine or their skiing holiday fund or something.
Definitely more towards the latter of what you were saying, towards benefit recipients. Yes.
Jerry, let's go back to you. It really is a difficult conundrum. I know you're interested now in incremental rate rises, but where do you think interest rates should peak? That is a question for so many people watching and listening who have got mortgages, who have got other personal loans that are on variable rates. Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were before the global financial crisis, when interest rates in the UK were routinely 6, 7, 8% or even higher?
Saying that inflation will decelerate. So yet to peak, it's going to remain elevated, then it will decelerate next year. I work on the assumption it will not return to the 2% target for some time, but may settle 3 to 4% by the end of next year. But no one knows, once you let the inflation genie out of the bottle, where it does actually go to. But groupthink is a problem at the Treasury and the Bank of England. But prior to this pandemic and the crisis, groupthink was a problem amongst central bankers. At Jackson Hole 3 years ago, the annual gathering of central bankers, they had a few graphs showing R-star, neutral interest rates for Western economies, all converging around zero. Interest rates, I think, need to be higher than the rate of inflation. Interest rates need to go higher to actually curb the rate of inflation, and we're starting behind the curve. So if inflation settles, say, at 3%, we have growth at 2%, the Bank of England, in my view, should have a new target, not inflation, nominal GDP, 4 to 5%, and interest rates, I think, should settle at 4%. The challenge, as we heard on Monday, the Bank of England itself didn't know the figures in terms of how many people were on 2-year or 5-year fixed-rate mortgages. Reuters had to find that out. 1.5 million people come off 2-year fixes this year, 1.5 million people come off 2-year fixes next year. So curbing inflation means raising rates, but we have to be sensitive, as your colleagues have said, to the state of the economy as well.
Jerry Lyons, Chief Economist at Net Wealth. Great to have you with me on the show. And indeed, Frank van Leuven of the New Economics Foundation. You're always welcome. And Vicky Price, of course, Chief Economist at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. An interesting and important discussion that obviously we're going to return to these vital issues in future episodes. Lots more coming after the break. That's after the GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it's 1:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. Labour repeated its call today for a windfall tax on energy companies to try to help with the rising cost of living. They did this on the day the inflation rate hit a 40-year high. The Consumer Price Index hit 9% in the 12 months to April. That's up from 7% in March. Well, speaking at Prime Minister's questions, Boris Johnson promised to look at all measures available to help struggling families. But Sir Keir Starmer accused the government of inaction. A Conservative MP has been released on bail pending further investigation after being arrested on suspicion of rape and sexual assault offences between 2002 and 2009. The man can't be named for legal reasons. He's in his 50s. He's also accused of abusing a position of trust and misconduct in public office. The Tory Chief Whip has asked the MP to stay away from Parliament during the investigation. More than 260 small boats have crossed the English Channel into UK waters so far this year. It takes the total number of people who've been pulled from boats to over 8,700. It's more than double the number who crossed at this time last year. In Seville, streets are closed, barriers are up, officers are on high alert as more than 100,000 Scottish football fans arrive in the Spanish city. Well, some Rangers supporters have already been seen partying outside the stadium as they anticipate and look forward to the Europa League final. The game kicks off against Eintracht Frankfurt at 7 tonight. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound is 1.242 to the dollar. The pound is 1.81 to the euro. The price of gold currently stands at £1,456.43 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for real-time investment.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome back. It's 1:36. You're on the money. And today, it's Startup Britain, my regular feature on some of the UK's most interesting startups. My guest today is Harry George. He's Managing Director of AccuraData, a company which helps its customers to actually buy data. And AccuraData supplies data which is GDPR compliant, email and telemarketing lists to help drive sales, to make deals. The company also offers a range of specialist data sets for specific industries, such as telecoms and merchant services. And they work with the likes of, which work a bit like PayPal. Interestingly, AccuraData's flagship product, business-to-business energy renewal data, helps UK energy brokers and suppliers target businesses whose energy contracts are coming up for renewal. A pretty hot topic, to say the least. Harry, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
So the business started in 2020. I mean, data, it's like the new oil, isn't it? It lubricates the economy. It's like the driving force of a lot of marketing, a lot of sales.
Yeah.
So what's actually involved when you sell somebody else's data?
Oh, well, you obviously have to be careful first and foremost, because with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, bit of a tongue twister to be fair. 'Cause what that is, that's the legal framework to essentially simplify and enhance the privacy and the control of data subjects in the EU. Because bear in mind, this was brought in 2018, so when we were in the EU.
Still, we hadn't had the transition period, have we?
Exactly that, yeah. So there's loads of ways of processing data lawfully. The one which we use is called legitimate interest. So to achieve legitimate interest, what you have to do is a balancing assessment. So what that is balancing the privacy of the data subject against your right to process that data, basically. So that's how we do it. And like I said, we've been selling data for the last 2 years, and it's what most businesses use to.
Your browsing history, it shows you're interested in certain things. You might actually quite welcome hearing about new offers. As long as you're not overloaded, there's definitely a balance to be struck, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think as a data provider, I think you should be cautious about where your data is going, of course, but that's why there's regulation and laws in place to mitigate against the risk of people doing it illegally or whatnot. So what we do, and with the energy renewal data, for instance, so most of the data is bringing them for the purpose of getting them a cheaper deal on their electric and gas, that's classed as a legitimate interest.
In general, Harry, is it but they have to strike this balance between letting people know about things they might legitimately, your word correctly, want to know about, and not invading them, not having sort of weird situations where you mention something and Alexa might pick it up and then suddenly you're getting, emails asking you to buy carpet slippers because you mentioned carpet slippers in your kitchen. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and I'm not accusing Alexa or Amazon of anything untoward or illegal, of course. I'm just saying sometimes it's a little bit creepy.
Yeah, of course, I've had the exact same thing. I've been talking to my friends about things and then I'm not the person to tell you why that happens. But look, in regards to us, you just got to be careful. And like I said, another thing GDPR has done is given the regulators like the ICO more authority.
Who's the ICO?
The ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office.
Of course,
so they're essentially the people who, impose sanctions or fines on the businesses
and
who
those
aren't
fines
doing
bite. You've heard of companies being fined.
Yeah, so a lot of the reasons the fines happen, for instance, is so when you do data, for instance, you have to make sure the customer isn't on the TPS register, which is the telephone preference register.
I see.
So say if you don't want to be called, you can put yourself on this list. So if you do then get called, you will then obviously have the right to take it further.
Yeah.
With businesses, it's called CTPS, which is corporate TPS. So that's how we make sure every customer our clients are dealing with doesn't want to be called, and it's the same sort of thing with email marketing as well.
So Accurate Data is in the business of, buying and selling this data, obviously within the law, obviously in a responsible manner. Yeah. So you are in the business of big data. That's what it's called, isn't it? And big data is big money.
Well, that's what we're trying to grow into.
Yeah.
So at the moment, we're just a seller of data. We want to essentially use the data to enhance our products, enhance our service, enhance our customer satisfaction. And that's what big data does. It gives you a bigger analysis of, the key points to target and implement into your business.
Well, Harry, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. It's a huge part of our emerging high-tech economy. Accurate Data is playing a role in it, and it's good to see you here.
Thanks for having me on.
Our latest Startup Britain guest. Now, as we've been reporting, inflation is at its highest rate for 40 years here in the UK. But here at On the Money, it's important we speak directly to you, to your businesses that are impacted by inflation. Our reporter Will Hollis joins us from Mansfield in the East Midlands. Will, it's great to have you with us. What are you making of these huge inflation numbers, and how about how they're going down on the high street in Mansfield?
Good afternoon. Yeah, lots of people will be making that periodical decision to look at their finances, look at where they can maybe save a little bit of money, where they should save a little bit of money, and where they can actually make a few sacrifices. Of course, when you're seeing things like 9%, it's often a value that people have already been experiencing. 9%, that's the figure for April. And of course, at the start of April, we saw that 54% hike in the price cap, the off-gem price cap. Now, where people might find that they can save a little bit of money is, of course, in their supermarkets or by going to the high street and actually looking at where the different cost-saving mechanisms can be actually inputted. So I've been speaking to one butcher who's been on the high street actually here in Mansfield for 40 years. So he's seen this period and knows kind of how this level of inflation can affect his business and affect his consumers. So I've been asking him, how are your consumers feeling at the moment?
People are buying very carefully. They watch what they're spending. They're looking for better cuts of meat, expensive cuts of meat to go further. And they're buying a lot more sort of sausage and bacon, cooking breakfast a lot more. We're selling loads more sausage rolls for some reason, and steak pies.
How is it in comparison to maybe people that would have liked to go for a restaurant meal? Are you finding that people are changing their shopping habits and coming here instead of going out to eat in Mansfield or other big cities?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think people are preferring to cook at home, knowing what they've got. They've got value for money. They've paid it up front and they've got value for money. They've got a plate full of meat. What more do they want?
And how is the wider cost of living crisis affecting you as a businessman?
We've just got to look at what we're doing, look at what we're selling, probably better products at a better price, upping his game a little bit and getting value for money.
And what about things like fuel? How is that affecting, your prospects for driving? Anything that you might do with deliveries? People bringing the product to you that you're going to have to sell here?
The deliveries have been affected. They only come 3 times a week to us. Now we used to be delivered daily, but now we have it 3 times a week. We can get by, we can do it. Sort of planners the game a bit more, so we have a delivery 3 times a week rather than daily.
Are you finding that people seem quite worried about their money? The conversations that they have, people that you know quite well and have become friends and in some ways family, are you noticing that they're talking about it in quite a fearful way, or are people just accepting what's happening?
Well, people have got to accept it. I think people are fed up of it on the news. Everywhere we turn, there's increases everywhere, fuel everywhere. People have just accepted it and they just seem to buy with confidence, I think. A bit more confidence in it.
And I think the message there, the idea from Tracy certainly is that his customers are getting quite used to this cost of living crisis. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that they aren't having challenges, but they are getting used to seeing these price increases and getting used to having to make decisions that they wouldn't have had to make 1 year or 2 years ago.
Will Hollis in Mansfield in East Midlands, great to have you on the show. Now, the UK Railway, once the lifeblood of the British economy, contributed well over £40 billion back in 2019 while providing 700,000 jobs. That's according to the consultancy Oxford Economics. But since the pandemic hit back in 2020, the railway has quite literally struggled to get back on track, with UK rail passenger numbers falling to their lowest level now in peacetime since 1872. You heard that right. And even as the network begins to recover, the rise in flexible working from home means, how can I put this, less bums on seats. New figures from the Centre for Policy Studies suggest peak time passenger numbers Monday to Friday are just 15% of pre-pandemic levels, given this trend towards working from home. So is radical reform needed, or will working from home kill our railways? Joining me now is Tony Lodge, Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and the person who led this research. Great to have you with us, Tony. The Centre for Policy Studies, obviously a leading Westminster-based think tank. You guys talk to ministers, senior civil servants all the time. You help drive policy. How worried are you about our railways?
It's a major issue. You have now got the
former golden goose of the home counties London South East commuter market flat on its back. People are no longer coming in the peaks 5 days a week, coming in early, going home in the early evening, for which they pay large season ticket annual fees. The fundamental point here is we need a vastly advanced modern digital technology around retailing to get passengers back. We need to sweat the leisure market, the long-distance old intercity market, which has actually come back quite quickly.
There's more staycations and so on.
Absolutely right. But fundamentally, that golden goose we always relied on, the home counties London South East commuter market, is not coming back. And that requires a very radical alternative ambition.
I mean, generally it would be companies paying for, $5-6 grand a year for a season ticket. People aren't buying season tickets as much. They're buying carnets. They're buying, because they're only going in 2 or 3 days a week. Working from home is probably an ongoing thing now, however much certain ministers rail against it. So what's the future for our railways? Does that mean the government has to put in much, much more money to subsidise the railways? There's already an annual subsidy, but the so-called fare box has generally taken most of the weight of the financial strain, hasn't it? Is that going to completely change now, Tony?
Well, if you do not get the passengers back, Liam, the subsidy will have to go up, and we'll find ourselves in an old British rail spiral of decline. And that could lead to cuts, it could lead to line closures, it could lead to all sorts of huge changes in connectivity, which actually, by the way, privatisation wasn't done properly, but that's not for today. The fundamental point was that rail passenger use doubled in 20 years between 1993 and 2013.
When John Major's government privatised the railway in the mid-90s.
Now, that was obviously a major boon for the country. We also need to get people back onto the long-distance trains, but we also need to boost rail freight. That is a huge income for the railways.
It's a very environmentally friendly way of getting stuff around, isn't it? Rail freight.
It's hugely environmental. We now hear about people whizzing around in lorries and cars delivering Amazon parcels. There needs to be much more containers from the ports on the railways, much more what I will call loose packaging, parcels ordered. There even almost needs to be an examination around, do we need parcel depots back at railway stations?
Yeah.
It's all there to be had.
Yeah.
We've
so people can just pick the stuff up from their local railway station.
Royal Mail
when they want, rather than having to wait in for the knock at the door that you miss because you're upstairs.
And Liam, it's a great income for the railways, is rail freight. It used to have a very big set income from things like coal. That's gone. So it's intermodal, containers, it should be loose freight, it should be aggregates. Transport emissions are very stubborn. They haven't moved in 20 years. One way to address that is less HGVs on the motorways, get people out of the cars. I'll give you a quick good example. York to London is about 210 miles. It's very well served, is York, and it's a fast rail link. You can get there in 1 hour 40 from King's Cross. 80% of the journeys to York, between York and London, are still done in a car.
Wow.
There's something missing here. So the retail offer from rail has to be better.
Do you sense among ministers there is that they've grasped that our railways are heading for crisis? If our lifestyles change, so a lot of the sort of laptop classes, if you like, the professional classes who use the trains are no longer using the trains. Are we in danger of really losing some lines, sort of Dr. Beeching Mark II, a lot less frequency, a lot less connectivity? This is the complete opposite, Tony, of what levelling up was meant to be about.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely right. There are 2 key points about this. We are opening new lines just as this crisis has hit. We will soon open a high-speed too. We're opening Crossrail here, next door, in next week.
Basically from the Thames Valley, Reading, all the way over to Shenfield in Essex. Now, Europe's biggest infrastructure project.
Now, when we modelled this 10, 15 years ago, it was for an expanding city with more people coming in and more people travelling in London and around London. Sadiq Khan has already received nearly £4 billion to keep the tube going because the peak flows aren't coming in anymore like
the London Mayor, yeah.
Now, the London Mayor will need more money to keep Crossrail going. Now, the fundamental point about this is Treasury at some stage will say no. If you haven't got a plan...
They're good at that.
If they are. I would argue sometimes in the interest of the taxpayer, but there will be a point here where they will say to the DfT, we need to see a plan to grow this thing again, the network. If there isn't one, we will stop giving you the money you keep asking for.
Wow. I mean, this is really big stuff, isn't it? I mean, God, there's so much public policy knocking around at the moment. There's the cost of living crisis. There's a war in Ukraine. NATO's expanding. All these huge geopolitical shifts. Meanwhile, it's sort of nitty-gritty, detailed policy about really important sectors that's barely being touched. How often are we debating the railways on television, and yet how important are they to our economy?
Well, especially if you're going to go for net zero as well, you are going to have to get many more people back on trains. Or you are going to have more people sitting in the M62, the M1 and God knows where in queues because road congestion will get worse. Is there going to be road pricing? That's another debate. That might help get people back on trains. But the train offer has got to be so much better. It's got to be passenger-led, which is... But there was a report in 1982, no one's ever heard of it. Everyone's heard of Beeching, but there was the Serpil report, which Mrs Thatcher commissioned. She actually didn't accept its findings, which was... we find passenger ridership coming down and down and down and down. We've got possibly rail strikes being announced as early as next week with an RMT ballot.
Indeed.
Which could not come at a worse time. If we get to a stage where this is a crisis again, you're going to have to ask someone like Serpil to look at it again. His proposal was you lose 40% of the network.
Wow.
You keep the intercity lines and the home counties commuter lines and some freight lines, and that's it.
Wow, even more traffic on the roads to get to those mainline stations. You've obviously been doing a lot of rail policy nerding, Tony, of which I completely approve. In a nutshell, your 30-second vision of what our railways will be in 10 years.
I hope they will be completely different with regards to the ticketing and retail offer. We have got to have... I mean, there's an Amazon Fresh store near me that's amazing. You download the app, you walk around putting things in a basket, and then you walk out with a bag. There's no till. We have got to look at the swiftest and easiest technology-led retail offer. Then you will start to get people back.
Making it easier to buy specific tickets at specific times.
Well in advance.
Well in advance for specific prices. Tony Lodge, really enjoyed the chat to you. You are from the Centre for Policy Studies, and I'm grateful to you for this conversation on a very, very important and much neglected topic. That's all we've got time for today. Stay tuned as it's she's back. Alex, she's up next with We Need to Talk About. And she's here in the studio now. Alex,
Hi, Liam.
What do you got coming up for us?
Well, as per usual, we're discussing the big stories of the day. So we're going to be asking, how are the Just About managing at all? Liz Truss is also being questioned over her plan to tie foreign aid to trade. So we'll be asking, is it necessary to give money abroad to challenge China? And as America open up their UFO files with a big tell-all to the Pentagon, apparently there have been 400 UFO sightings by military in America alone. We're going to be asking whether there have been any aliens visiting Blighty as well.
That's Alex Phillips. I look forward to watching that. So join me tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I'll be back. I'll be continuing to focus on the cost of living crisis, helping you beat the squeeze. Thanks for joining me today. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and that was On the Money.
Hi there, I'm Aidan McGibbon from the Met Office. Warm, sunny spells for many of us through the rest of the day. There will be some rain or showers later, and the risk of thunderstorms towards the southeast this evening and overnight. At the moment, we're in between weather fronts, and in between these fronts, a plume of humid air moving up from the south will bring the threat of showers and thunderstorms later, before a cold front brings some rain to the west as well overnight. But ahead of that rain, plenty of sunny spells, the best of the sunshine across much of Scotland, central and eastern England. The sunshine turning more hazy towards the south, west, and some showers making an appearance into Cornwall by this stage. So 16 Celsius for Plymouth, 18 for Glasgow, 24 there for London. So feeling pleasant in the sunshine, but it doesn't last for the west. Cloud building, wet and windy weather pushing into Northern Ireland and western Scotland, and then some thunderstorms, lively outbreaks of rain with hail and lightning spreading into East Anglia and the south.